Good morning, good afternoon, and evening to everybody, depending where you are. I'm Fernando Bellezzi, and I'm going to be moderating this panel today. We are starting now the panel Transparency in the Leather Supply Chain from Pasture to Footwear. We know there are some people who are still connecting, but to ensure we are on time, I'll start here. And the video will be available tomorrow on the APLF website and also YouTube. During the next 45 minutes, we'll be discussing how responsible choices and the development of best practices in the value chain, from farms all the way to brands, can lead to positive change and support the fight against climate change. Before we start, I would like to thank Dr. Frank Mittliner from the University of California, Davis, Mike Gass from Timberland, and Mauricio Bayer from WWF for their time and interest in being with us today discussing this important topic. I would also like to thank APLF for organizing this panel as part of the APLF Academy. The APLF Academy aims at providing a series of trainings, programs, and discussions to raise sustainability awareness around valuable topics to the entire leather and fashion supply chain. We'll divide this panel in two parts. We'll start now with a round of presentations from the panelists, followed by a questions and answer session at the end. We would like to start first with Professor Mittliner. He's a professor and air quality specialist at UC Davis. He's also the director of the CLEAR Center, working at bringing clarity to the intersection of animal agriculture and the environment, helping to understand the environmental and human health impacts of livestock, so we can make informed decisions about the foods we eat and other products of animal origin we consume while reducing environmental impact. Dr. Mittliner, thank you very much for being here. It's with you now.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today and to my panel members. My name is Frank Mittliner, and I'm a professor and air quality specialist here in animal science at UC Davis. And as such, I do research and I teach. I also do a lot of extension, bringing information from the university out into the real world like I do today. My main research is really in the field of quantifying the air impact of livestock and poultry, finding out just how much livestock and poultry emits with respect to gases such as ammonia or hydrogen sulfide, particles, odors, but also, of course, greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are a hot topic right now. So I quantify those with my team and, most importantly, mitigate those. This is the centerpiece of my lab, that we mitigate all of these pollutants to the largest extent possible. What's really interesting to me is a change in the narrative around methane. Methane undoubtedly is the most important greenhouse gas from animal agriculture at this point. And in my opinion, the Achilles heel of animal agriculture. Why? Because it makes up for such a significant part of the warming footprint of livestock and poultry. What makes methane really interesting is that it is really quite different compared to other greenhouse gases. Let's say carbon dioxide, CO2, or nitrous oxide, two gases that once they are emitted into the air, they stay there for hundreds of years, in some cases thousands of years. And that makes them really serious, because once you put them into the air, they stay there pretty much forever. Particularly true for CO2. But methane is different, because methane, while it's a very potent greenhouse gas, and that's a problem, methane is different insofar that it's not just produced, but there is a natural atmospheric removal process. So it's not just produced, it's also naturally removed, globally almost at equal percentage or at equal amounts. And that offers us a significant solution here, because if we keep our livestock herds stable, and in most parts of the world, in most parts of the developed worlds we do, then we are not adding new additional carbon to the atmosphere if we keep them stable. If we increase them, and in parts of the world that happens, then we are adding a significant problem to our atmosphere, because methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. We don't want this to happen, but in parts particularly of the developing world, it does happen because the demand for animal source food increases, and oftentimes that's met with increasing numbers of livestock raised. So that can be a problem. And I think we can circumvent that by helping these countries, those regions, to become more efficient and satisfy their demand without growing livestock herds. But what's also very interesting, or most interesting to me, is what happens when you decrease methane. When you decrease methane, then you're actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, much like what would happen if you were to plant trees, and trees taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. A reduction of methane can really be a short-term solution to our climate problem. Because when you reduce methane, then you reduce this potent greenhouse gas from our atmosphere, and that offers a significant solution. Can that be done? Yes, it can be done, and it has been done. For example, here in California, where we have very aggressive methane goals of achieving a 40% reduction of methane, 40, a 40% reduction of methane by the year 2030. So that's around the corner. At first, when this law passed, our farmers went wild. They thought there's no chance that we can achieve such aggressive goals. But little did they know that the state had something in mind to assist them with achieving that. And that is that the state incentivized, financially incentivized, the reduction of methane by providing capital investment support to deploy methane reducing techniques and technologies, and to produce or provide so-called low carbon fuel standard credits. I just give you one example. Over the last 3 years, over 100 California dairies, and the dairy industry is very important here in the state, over 100 California dairies capped their lagoon. They covered the lagoon where the manure is stored. And so instead of these gases going into the air, they are now being trapped. The so-called biogas is now being trapped. 60% of that gas is approximately methane. So instead of going into the air, it's now trapped under top. And then it's not flared off or burned like it was in the past to produce power, but that biogas is now converted into fuel, into so-called renewable natural gas. And that renewable natural gas is then used to power or to fuel vehicle fleets like semi-trucks. So it's now replacing diesel, and that is a double whammy, because first, you're now not emitting these gases on the farm, and secondly, you're replacing diesel emissions with much cleaner RNG emissions. As a result, the state of California has granted those who do this the so-called low carbon fuel standard credits. That's a mouthful, low carbon fuel standard credits. They are very high. You get $200 per unit of CO2e, and that's very high support. And many farmers are jumping onto that opportunity. I believe that within the next 5 to 10 years, at least half of our dairies will have used this opportunity. And I also believe that this reduction of methane that's occurring gets us onto a path to climate neutrality. We have already today, after 3 years of this program, reduced methane from the dairy sector in California by 25%. So our goal is a 40%. We have already achieved a 25% reduction. And that is verified by the state and easily verifiable because you actually measure, you meter the amount of biogas produced and the amount of fuel produced. And that's not some green accounting or greenwashing or creative accounting, but it's, these are real numbers. So I'm very optimistic about manure emission reductions, as well as, and that's my last point, the fact that we have made huge progress in reducing methane from enteric emissions. Enteric emissions means the belching that comes out of the animal's mouth. We have found feed additives that you can feed to cattle, let's say, that reduce methane by anywhere between 10 to 50%. So to me, these are really good developments that help us reduce methane, and methane has such a short-term impact that we can counteract some of the other greenhouse gases, such as nitrous oxide and CO2, bringing us overall onto a path to climate neutrality. And with that, I pause and look forward to our questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mittlener. That's actually very interesting. And I think you mentioned two things. One, it's how to reduce emissions, but also how to better measure those things. And I think that leads to a very interesting debate. We're just going to go to Mike Gas right now, and then we'll come back with some questions around that. But now I want to introduce Mike Gas. He's an expert in product and material developments with more than 20 years of experience in the footwear industry. He's a lead developer at Timberland and an active member of Timberland's Green Working Group and product sustainability groups, directly engaged in the development of more sustainable materials and product. Mike, thank you very much for being here, and please introduce yourself.
Hello. Thanks very much, Fernando. I think you just did a great job of introducing me, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thanks to the other panelists. It's a pleasure to be here talking about this topic with you today. I would like to share a couple slides, if I might, just to sort of explain how we're looking at this from the Timberland brand perspective. So let me let's try this. Okay, can you see the screen, Fernando? All looking good? Okay, yes. So thank you. Timberland has recently released some pretty bold goals around product because we are just looking at this issue of climate change, thinking we obviously use a lot of leather. Leather and rubber are our top two materials. And each year, obviously, we're buying millions and millions of feet of leather and trying to figure out how can we make our product in a way that contributes to fixing this problem of climate change, rather than just thinking about it from a reducing our impact point of view, or maybe working towards neutrality. We decided that it would be best if we could figure out how to turn it into a conversation of contribution to net positive. How can we give back more than we take? So this is relatively inspired by nature. Inspired by nature, Timberland will design net positive products for a greener future, giving back more than we take. And this concept is basically based around circularity. You probably recognize this image from The Lion King. Through this approach, nature doesn't ever waste anything, right? There's a circular process to the whole thing. Nature can regenerate itself. And when it comes to our product, we think about that, and we believe we can take inspiration from nature and make decisions in building our product that will lead to a more positive outcome for the environment and help to restore some of the degradation that's taking place, some of the problems that have been caused, by the methane and the CO2 and the other things that you heard from Professor Mittlerner. When it comes to our product, we're planning on by 2030 building 100% of our product for circularity, and then all of our natural materials, such as leather, will be sourced regeneratively. Now, when we think about the regenerative agriculture piece, this was kind of an education to most of us in the brand, and a few of you or most of you may be familiar with regenerative agriculture, but it was definitely a learning for us on the product team. This slide is basically just showing some of the problems that Professor Mittlerner was discussing about our degraded soils, too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and the fact that without the carbon in the soil, there isn't really any life. So we need to restore that. And the way that we can do that from a Timberland perspective when we make our product is by sourcing regenerative leather. this regenerative agriculture, when we think about it from a cattle perspective, is animals moving freely around the land or in adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So they're rotating around the farm in one spot for a certain amount of time, eating all the grass and forage. And then when that fuel is exhausted to them, we move them over into another pasture, allowing the first one to rest and then moving on to the second one. And the natural process of the animals eating and excreting basically enriches the ground and makes it more ripe for storing the carbon that is so needed to be pulled out of the atmosphere. And then what we're thinking about from the brand perspective is that it's important for us to figure out if we know that these cattle are actually coming from regenerative farms, right? So we set up a few standards around what it looks like so that we know that the leather is certified regenerative and that we can claim that when we look to do our marketing to appeal to consumers, that Timberland is actually working hard to make a difference through building its product. So we have set the standard of it being 100% grass-fed so that the animals are grass-fed for their entire lives. And then at some point, there's a practice and or outcome-based regenerative verification. So soil measurement to measure the amount of carbon in the soil at the beginning and maybe the amount of carbon in the soil at the end. And this regenerative agriculture looks different in different areas of the world. So it's not super prescriptive, this formula. It's basically, are you doing these practices of adaptive multi-paddock grazing? Is there 100% grass-fed certification for the life of the animal? And then are you engaged in some sort of environmental outcome verification program? Now, this was all completely new for Timberland in that we hadn't really been looking to source regenerative hides before. And so we basically had to build this supply chain from the ground up. And this is where it gets really interesting for the brand. We partnered with a company called Other Half Processing that has really helped us identify farmers using these regenerative practices and created these relationships that have been so valuable for the brand to engage in and unusual for certain. This is all new to Timberland. This group, Other Half Processing, is a trusted partner of the farmers, has identified these farmers and has engaged in separating these hides out from maybe hides that aren't necessarily raised regeneratively, preserving them and transporting them to our wet blue tannery, DR Dietrich. So when we think about how that's worked for the brand and what opportunities it's opened up for us, it's allowed for collaboration with this new business. It's allowed for us to develop relationships with the farmers. It's allowed for a market signal to be sent to farmers and people practicing regeneratively that there's a call or a demand for their leather. And then excitingly enough, in fall 20, we launched our very first product made from regenerative leather, just a men's and women's boot. And we are really excited to partner with Other Half Processing and the Savory Institute, Thousand Hills Lifetime Graze. So as you can see, there are a lot of partners involved in just bringing these two boots to life. And it's really exciting for us as a brand and looking forward to the conversation today. So with that, I will pass it on to Mauricio. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. It's a very admirable initiative, and we see there's a lot of work behind. You need a lot of partnership support, but we'll be able to talk more about that and learn a little bit more from your experience in a moment.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to introduce Mauricio. Thank you very much for joining us, Mauricio. Mauricio is the Senior Director for Beef and Leather Supply Chains with WWF USA, with 20 years of executive corporate experience in agriculture commodities in the United States, Australia, and Brazil. Mauricio provides strategic coordination and guidance in the development and execution of WWF's global beef and leather strategies to eliminate the deforestation, conversion, and degradation of critical habitats in Latin America that results from the production of beef and leather. Mauricio, thank you very much. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Yes. Well, thank you, Fernando. Thank you, my fellow participants and APLF for the opportunity. It's great to be here. It's good to be among people that are like-minded, so we can increase the level of our discussions. I'm going to show you a few slides just to complement what I'm going to say. I promise it's not going to be long. Let me see if I can share my screen. Here. At WWF, we work, we believe in a collaborative approach. So the program that I am involved in most of my time is focused on developing solutions with the corporate sector to implement. Let me see, how can I move my slide forward? There you go. Yeah, it's essentially a little bit of what I do. I'm responsible for WWF's beef and leather strategies. We look for robust sector-wide implementation commitments to eliminate environmental degradation from commodity supply chains, especially in threatened geographies where advancement of agricultural practices are a source of a cause of land use or land conversion. We adopt a corporate engagement activity approach where we identify strategic opportunities for partnerships, leveraging from WWF Global Network, fostering relationships to influence positive actions. Essentially, this is what's happening right now, making a bridge between academia, private sector, power brokers in the industry, platforms that can amplify this message across the beef and leather value chains. We also work with consumer engagement strategies, supporting community enterprises and solutions that are all the time popping up. And sometimes we find it's complicated for companies to navigate in this myriad of these new solutions that are out there in the marketplace. I'll talk a little bit more when the questions asked and during the debate. On April 29, WWF will become, the panda will turn 60. So I ask people to keep an eye out there for what's coming. And I'll close for now. Allow more time for our discussions instead of me talking about myself.
That's very good, Mauricio. Thank you very much. And I think one of the words you said, collaboration, is probably the key for improvement. And I believe this is something we can address during our discussion. Just before we start our discussion, I just want to share briefly with you a perspective from tanneries. In our case, what we are doing at Prime Asia. We are a tannery working with leather for footwear, for athletics and the casual business. And what we've seen in the past is that the tanning industry always tends to say that we couldn't address issues at farm level because we are not connected with farmers, and this is something that is related to the food industry. So we couldn't. There was no way we could be part of that discussion. That we are just processing a byproduct. But what we saw with Prime Asia is that we are an important connection between brands, between consumers, and also food companies, farmers. And as being that connection, we are able to help in the communication. We are able to promote best standards, and by doing so, we are able to foster demand for best practices and help to create a virtual cycle that will improve the practice at farm level. So last year, we started an initiative that we call Responsibly Raised. In that initiative, we selected a group of attributes that we look in our suppliers at farm level. So we are looking for initiatives where we can ensure sound animal welfare standards. We can ensure that at farm level, the farmers are making better use of natural resources, which will result in lower CO2 emissions. We are talking about projects that are 100% traceable to the farm of birth. This a lot of times is challenging on the leather industry, so we thought it was important to come up with a stronger traceability system, ensure best labor practices, and be sure that all these things we are talking about are third-party verified, so we have a more transparent communication with our brands and consumers. As part of this project, we have already added two different programs. One is with an initiative of natural meats in the US, the Open Prairie Natural Meats, and the other one works with organic farms in Brazil with Minerva Leather. I will not get in too many details here. I think it's important that we have the discussions, but just to give a very quick overview, in the US program, all the leathers, as I mentioned, are traceable to the farm of birth. There is a strict verified animal welfare standard, so all farms, transportation, the packing facilities, everybody is verified against animal welfare standards. They follow the best quality assurance program in the US, so there's also a layer of environmental practice where farms are verified against their environmental management, their farming standards. So it's a very interesting program. In Brazil, we work with, sorry, I have the wrong slide here, but anyway, we work with organic farms in which they all work with a series of good practice connected to organic systems. So they are ensuring that they are working with the protection of land, soil, that they are protecting biodiversity, that they work with techniques such as rotation, crop covers, the use of animal materials as fertilizers, that they are not working with synthetic fertilizers. And there's also, because it's a Brazilian program, there's an important part related to monitoring those farms to ensure they are not involved with deforestation, they are not involved in invasions of protected areas, indigenous areas. This program carries a unique traceability system that each hide is traced back to the farm of birth. The hides are physically stamped, and we can enter in the monitoring program, and we have this system that use satellite images and public databases that allow us to see where those farms are, but more important, what's their status related to deforestation, related to best practices, related to ensuring that they are not involved with rural conflicts. Again, this is it's really just a short introduction. I think the most important part here is to have the discussions with all these important panelists. Just one last slide. The idea here is that we look at projects that help us to not ensure that the best practice at farm level, but ensure that those hides, they are processed in best class tanneries, so LWG rated facilities compliant with ZDHC, with hides that are traceable back to farm of birth, so brands can have responsible footwear made, and they can share those stories with their customers. But I'll stop here, and I think it's important that we go back to the discussion. Now I'm going to ask to all panelists to open your mics so we can have a chat. And Dr. Mittlener, if you allow me, I would like to go back to you. You mentioned about the projects. University of California, Davis is working on capturing emissions, reducing those emissions. You gave the example where in California they are covering the lagoons. But as Mike mentioned, livestock production, and you wrote well in the Washington Examiner article, livestock production can possibly also sequestrate carbon from the raising of animals. Can you give us a little bit more of background about that?
Yeah, there are different ways that one can reduce the climate impact of livestock. One is to reduce emissions, such as what I talked about before, by covering lagoons, trapping the gases, converting them into fuels. That really reduces the carbon intensity of the fuels that we use in our transportation system overall. Something that just went into the air before, unfiltered, is now converted into fuel. So that's a good thing. The other thing that I mentioned before, the reductions of enteric emissions, that's a big deal because that's the #1 greenhouse gas source from animal agriculture. But then you mentioned sequestration is another very important angle. And my colleague Mike here just alluded to that. Mauricio did too, that sequestration is an important angle. So how does that work? It works by us emphasizing the importance of our soils and converting something that was dirt before into real soil, meaning a microbially rich base that helps accelerate soil carbon sequestration, the process by which plants such as grasses, legumes, pull carbon out of the air during photosynthesis. That carbon goes through the above ground into the below ground, the roots, and from the roots into the soil. And then that carbon is stored in the soil, where we hope to keep it, because unless we till it and plow it, that carbon should stay there for a long time, maybe forever. The question is, how far can we go? How much carbon can our soils store? Does this go on endlessly? It does not go on endlessly, but it is a significant sink. Our soils are trapping 1/3 of all human-caused greenhouse gases. 1/3 of all human-caused carbon is stored in our soil. Think about that. So they are our best friends. And so I admire what you do there, my dear colleagues, and I think we need to do more to get the importance of our soils clearly communicated with the entire agricultural sector. Everybody can do more, not just cattle farmers or so. Everybody can do more through low-till or no-till, or really focus on improving our soil health.
That's incredible. 1/3 of emissions. That's a bold number, I would say. And you mentioned, well, you can sequestrate, but you can also reduce the emissions. You mentioned about the changing the feeding of animals. Can you apply that kind of measure to any kind of cattle raising systems, or does it apply to specific systems? Is it something that you can apply broadly?
It is more challenging to do it under grazing conditions. Why? Because we have less access to the animals themselves. Under intensive conditions, where you have a trough into which you put a ration, you can easily add some feed additive or so. And in the future that will happen. So in feedlots or on dairies and so on, there will be feed additives used, like essential oils or tannins or seaweed or something else. But what do you do with cattle on pasture? That's the question, because you don't get hold of them day in, day out. So we are working internationally on solutions for that, of getting the active ingredients from some of those additives into a form that we can put into even grazing animals. For example, if you put this active ingredient into a bolus, and then you lodge it into the animals, through the animal's mouth in its digestive system, so that it slowly releases the active ingredient, that might be one way. There might also be vaccinations possible in the future to inhibit methane production. So under grazing conditions, that's really important. We need to do more research and find better solutions. Under intensive conditions, it would be easier.
Interesting. Yeah, but I think that the positive thing here is that there are solutions, there are ways of doing better. We just need to invest more and ensure those actions are being taken.
I would say that we are about 5 years away from having viable solutions that are available in the feed store.
That's good. We are all looking for faster answers, but 5 years, it's not that far, I would say. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Dr. Mitlin, but I want to ask something to Mike. And Mike, you mentioned Timberland's goals, and they are very aggressive when you talk about having 100% of natural materials sourced from regenerative agriculture by 2030. I think the motivation you've talked about already, it's really finding ways of mitigating your impacts and trying to also improve what you're doing. But what are the challenges behind those goals? What are you finding right now that makes it hard to achieve those goals, and how are you addressing that?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question, and there are a myriad of challenges, right? There aren't enough materials available from regenerative sources to fill our needs from a product perspective. So we're having to partner with other businesses that are helping us identify these types of sources and growers. And it's nice to see, as this space is expanding, that there are quite a few partners that are available for us to work with. It's interesting to see, other industries as well, like even the food industry, looking for regenerative sources as well. And that helps drive, the increase in availability of us to find the necessary materials that we need. I think I mentioned in the slides that, a lot of this, we're having to build the supply chains from the ground up, and that's time consuming, and it's difficult for the brand from a perspective of, we used to build a line of product and we would spec a material, and then we would send an email and send a PO and order that material. And now in a lot of ways, we're having to figure out how to get a material out of an area of Thailand, for instance, and get it into our supply chain, where before that wasn't someplace that we were looking to bring a material in from. So think, all of the hurdles that happen in that sort of thing. There's customs issues, there's import issues, there's transportation issues, preservation of the material. All these things that we sort of took for granted before are now necessitating additional effort and manpower to figure out how to smooth the bumps on the way to just get the materials to then where we start to build the product. Whereas before, we were mostly concerned with making a really good shoe or apparel that's going to, fit the body well, be comfortable, and last a long time. And now we're taking it all the way back to where those materials are coming from. So those are probably some of the bigger challenges.
Yeah, I think only after you make bold commitments and you really look for ways of improving things considerably, is that you really identify those challenges. But it's good to see that you are looking for ways of addressing those challenges. Another interesting goal that Timberland has set is to become net positive by 2030. What is the role of natural materials, not only leather, but cotton, wool, in achieving those goals? Do they have an important role in that strategy?
Yeah, they certainly do, right? When we think about how we source those materials, we're thinking that the regenerative practices used to grow these materials are probably our best ability to fill that part of the equation, right? We're going to do this by making products that last a long time. We're going to do this by building products that are designed to be taken apart and potentially remade into other things or recycled. We're going to use recycled synthetic materials. But when it comes to natural materials, this regenerative agriculture opportunity is the one that's going to provide the most benefit for us as we try to add up all those parts and pieces and take it from, the conversation from just reducing impact or being carbon neutral to instead being net positive, right? And sort of giving back more. So that's how we're looking at them.
That's good. That's very inspiring. I'll come back to you also in a minute, but now I have a question for Mauricio. Mauricio, we see that a lot of these things we are talking about here, they are very positive but very challenging to achieve, and we see that collaboration is a key word in achieving this kind of improvements. What role can NGOs play in the private sector's journey towards a more sustainable business model, especially in case of midstream and actors and brands that sometimes are not so close to the source?
Yeah, well, thank you, Fernando. Well, you have there are plenty of NGOs out there, and some of them adopt a business, a modus operandi that is more focused on, as we know, on advocacy and raising awareness and pointing out the problem. The role that we have in this space is as a collaborative role. So WWF works alongside companies and to provide solutions. So essentially, we serve as a bridge and a catalyzer for discussions globally, as well as transversal and regional conversations. We assist companies on how to define, implement, and monitor the various notions of sustainability. As I said before, you have forest positive, net positive, regenerative, conserving biodiversity, carbon stocks, ecosystem services, etc. This is it's not easy for a company to navigate and make robust, implementable, and credible commitments along those lines. We assist on identifying effective tools for implement commitments to deforestation and conversion free and to report on progress. That's key also for companies and make it credible sustainability claims for the marketplace. We provide tools that address commitments, implementation, supply chain engagement, risk assessment, transparency, that allow companies to develop, act, and report on their commitments. We foster the dialogue between companies and financial institutions, for example. So aligning capital is one of the lines of work that we have, where we explore incentives for more robust commitments and incentives along supply chains to the producers themselves, to transform, to shift the needle towards a more sustainable reality in the cattle sector. Align with the finance work to identify where international investors, for example, and banks would reinforce such incentives, so you can unlock financial mechanisms, credit lines based on environmental services, for example, and that can assist on that transformation on the producer side. Obviously, when you have a supply chain transparency, when you have an engagement, as you said, a collaboration throughout the supply chain, these signals can come up the stream and then demonstrate it. It's a market-led kind of a message.
Very interesting. Yeah, and it's good to have organizations such as WWF that comes with this know-how, these skills to support the different industries. And talking about the different industries from your experiences specifically with the beef and leather supply chains, how do you see how can the leather sector increase its leverage power to promote relevant shifting the needle of cattle range sector to enhance sustainability practices?
There's a mismatch between beef and leather market shaping forces, essentially. In most cases, it's a buyer's market for beef, for leather, sorry, and a seller's market for beef. So the forces at play are different. Leather is subject to pressures that beef usually is not, especially when you talk about high volume beef buyers, for example, from importing beef from Brazil. They are not consumer facing companies, and therefore they have very little in the way of reputational risk, for example. So we believe that bringing the leather and actors closer to the sustainability of beef discussions can deliver a positive result as an additional layer of incentive to transform the business model in the way beef is produced. And that's why we have approached, for example, leather power brokers to the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Those platforms where beef sustainability is openly discussed. We are members of, WWF is a member of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, We're also engaged with platforms, for example, in Brazil, where you have the Sustainable Cattle Working Group. In essentially a coordinated market-led push will be instrumental to secure credible meat packer commitments and effective implementation to deliver deforestation and conversion-free beef and leather products to the entire value chain. So when you have a meat packers and the aggregation point in the chain where the monitoring systems, the leather value chain essentially relies on monitoring systems that are effective at the meat packer level in their purchasing practices. There are some key elements that can be impactful in transforming the meat packers' practices. I have a few examples here that I jotted down, but when you have commercial incentives, for example, when you have a gradual increase of volume of verified deforestation and conversion free beef in a time-bound manner with specific KPIs associated with it, or penalties associated with failure to uphold expectations, agreements by meat packers, reduction or cancellation of contracts, suspensions. So there are a few mechanisms we can think of, but essentially, I think approximating the leather value chain to the beef value chain will be the next positive movement in the industry.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Mauricio. We are over our time already, but the APLF has kindly given us another 5 minutes. If you can stay another 5 minutes, I'll have just one question more for each of you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Excellent. Dr. Mittlener, back to you. What I see is that, you've been sharing a lot of positive news, a lot of opportunities for improvement in cattle ranching. Up to a point where cattle ranching can become a part of the solution rather than the problem. But you see also a lot of attacks related to cattle raising, to beef consumption. Where do you think is the disconnection between both sides of the story?
Well, I think there's no question that if you, for example, think of soil health, that livestock plays a very important role because they provide the nutrients that the soils need in order to accelerate, as I said before, for example, sequestration. There are other biosystem services that cattle and other livestock species provide, and we don't have the time to go into that. But what I can tell you is that while many advantages can be found, there are also liabilities. Okay, if you don't do cattle raising right, you might harm the environment. And the people who are critical of animal agriculture, they harp on those negative examples and depict them as if they were the standard, which they're not. They're not the standard. But when you have forms of animal abuse occurring on some outlier farms, or when you have some environmental degradation occurring on others, they're using those cases and they're depicting the entire industry as such. And that's a big problem, okay? That's a big problem, and it's very deceiving. What I can tell you is that the same people who are doing it on the environmental side have been doing this for a long time on other sides as well. For example, animal welfare, animal rights. There are many other areas, sectors that they had been playing in, and now that the carbon discussion is so large and looming, they have gloomed onto that one. They will always be critical of livestock. So to me, it is not as important to address a small, vocal outlier community of activists, but to work with farmers to do the best they can to be as sustainable as possible. That to me is the most important thing. Not to win a battle with somebody who's shouting at me. That to me is not important.
I agree. I think we need to understand where the problems were, where the opportunities for improvements are, and work on those. I think that's the most important part. Very, very good. Thank you, Dr. Mittlener. Mike, it's more on a recommendation side. What would you have to share with other brands that are thinking about going the same direction and that are looking to take similar steps? What do you have anything you can share with them that will make their journey less painful?
That's a great question. I think, honestly, I would just say, really just have to sort of set the goals that align with the brand and then take the first steps, right? I think that the first step is the most difficult one, the one that everybody's always terrified of and afraid that's going to be the biggest fall. But when we started taking those early steps, we just started recognizing that there is so much opportunity springing up in front of us and so many partnerships that we weren't aware of. And I think it's necessary for other brands, obviously, to get into this space to address some of the concerns that my other colleagues that were discussing in their answers to the questions. We need a collective effort. We need people to be looking to source things in more responsible ways. We need to be looking for people to be sourcing more things from regenerative sources, because ultimately we have to do what we can to take care of this earth, right? There is quite a need. There's a large greenhouse gas problem. There's a soil degradation problem. There's drought, right? The way for us to address this from a brand perspective is to try to seek our materials in better ways and allow for those better ways to help restore, help restore the environment so that we can all continue to do this and live, live in a nice place.
Very, very interesting. Take the first step and work collectively. I think it's two good advice. Mauricio, just to wrap up the discussion, you've been participating in many roundtables discussing the impact of leather with many players. In your opinion, what are the impacts of the reduction in use of leather for the planet?
Well, Fernando, reducing the use of leather doesn't mean reducing the production of cattle. Doesn't mean, especially with the production, with the demand for beef only increasing rapidly in countries. We have areas in the world, geographies in the world where they're food deserts. So gradually these places will have access to animal-focused protein commodities, and leather will continue to be a consequence of beef production. So if you reduce the use of leather, one of two things can happen, or both. More leather will be diverted to landfills, which Professor Frank can tell us how much methane that will generate or how much greenhouse effect that's very detrimental for the planet. Or if actors with more stringent social environmental safeguards requirements are abandoning leather, this will create a temporary vacuum in the marketplace, and this vacuum will eventually be filled by actors with less stringent requirements and gray channels and more opaque supply chains. So we lose track of what's happened to those leather, and we lose leverage to assist in transforming the cattle value chain, the meat packers' practices. So essentially, I think this is the answer. There are negative impacts of reduction in use of leather from the conservation standpoint. It's detrimental for the planet.
Very, very interesting. It's a completely different view from what we see sometimes. Gentlemen, we could talk for hours here. It's really nice to have the opportunity to speak with you. Unfortunately, we are over the time that was set aside for this panel. I just would like to thank you once again, Dr. Mittluner, Mike S., Mauricio Bauer, for your time and for your kind willingness in sharing some of your experiences. I wish you all a great day, and I just want to remind that this webinar is going to be available online as well on APLF's social medias from tomorrow.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Fernando.
Thank you.
Have a great week, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.